The deadlines, Kevin, to make these deals, because you just mentioned you're always open. The president said there's not really any flexibility left between now and Wednesday. Less than 2 weeks ago, the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, said that deals would be wrapped up by Labor Day. So I wonder, how can companies plan if the goalposts keep moving? How can countries negotiate if they don't even know how much time they have left?
Right. Well, the rough outlines of the deals are becoming clear to everybody because we have some deals like the UK and the Vietnam deal that are starting to be, I guess, guidelines for what might happen. But one of the things that we're seeing that's really interesting to me is that people are just onshoring production in the U.S. at a record rate. And so we've had record job creation, record capital spending, and this is even ahead of the big, beautiful bill. And so I think what's happening is that people are responding to President Trump's, potential threats to have high tariffs on countries by moving their activity here into the U.S., which is creating jobs, more than 2 million jobs since he took office, and raising wages. Wage growth is heading up towards the really, really high pinnacles that we saw in 2017. And so I think there's a race right now to get activity into the U.S., and in part that race has been kicked off by President Trump.
I remember after these reciprocal tariffs were announced, you told me that there were about 15 deals that countries were bringing to the president. How close, if you could give us any number at all, what number are we going to see this week?
Yeah, you'll have to get that from Jameson and the president. I think that we've seen lots of deals that have been finalized by our negotiators, and then the president finds things that can make them better. And so I'm not going to get ahead of the president on the number of deals.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. We'll look out for that. I want to move now to the one big, beautiful bill that, of course, the president signed into law on Independence Day. You have it, and now you have to pay for it. And there's a consensus that this bill adds tremendously to the deficit. I know that you are so familiar with these numbers. The Yale Budget Lab estimates it will add $3 trillion to the debt. The Tax Foundation says this tax portion of the bill could also add $3 trillion to the deficit. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which factors in interest on the debt, says it could add up to $5 trillion over the next decade. And on this very program, even Speaker Johnson answered in the affirmative when asked if this bill would add over $4 trillion to the deficit. I know that the administration says the bill will actually shrink the deficit by $1.5 trillion. Help me understand why there is such a drastic difference between your number and all those others.
Well, first of all, let's remember that science is not democracy. Truth is not democracy. Our estimates are based on modeling that we used last time when I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors to say what would happen if we had a bill, how much growth we would get. And we said, and we were criticized soundly, that we would get 3% growth. And we even had the really technical macroeconomic models that said that we would get 3% growth. We run the same models through this tax bill. It's even better. And what we're seeing is that if you get 3% growth again, then that's $4 trillion more in revenue than the CBO and these other bodies are giving us credit for. They have been wrong in the past, and they're being wrong again in our belief. But the thing that disappoints me is that if I put out a model and I say, hey, here's what's going to happen, we're going to get 3% growth, and then it turns out it's 1.5% growth, then as an academic economist, as a scientist, then it's my duty to say, what did I get wrong? What did my model miss? These people aren't doing that. And that's the thing that I find disappointing, because we put, peer-reviewed academic stuff on the table, said we're going to get that 3% growth, and then we got it right last time, and we believe we're going to get it right this time. But if you think that 1.8% growth is what's going to happen over the next 10 years, then you should agree with the CBO number. But there's another part of the CBO number that you need to worry about, and that is that if we don't pass the bill, that it's the biggest tax hike in history. And with that big tax hike, then of course we would have a recession. The CEA says that we'd have about a 4% drop in GDP and lose 9 million jobs. If we had a 4% drop in GDP and we lost 9 million jobs, what would happen to the deficit? And so I don't think that the CBO has a very strong record. I don't think that these places have a very strong record. And what they need to do is get back to the basics of looking at macroeconomic models. There's a really famous macroeconomist at Harvard named Jim Stock. They should go back and read everything Jim Stock has written for the last 15 years and fold those into their models, and then maybe we could talk.
I want to talk